Okay, hi everybody. So welcome to our last recorded lecture. I know that this wasn't actually the plan, but it appears that Mother Nature is not going to cooperate today. So I hope you're staying safe and warm on this ice day, maybe a little bit extra time to study. So that we don't get behind, I have elected to record this video, which you clearly know if you're watching it already. So I hope this is helpful, kind of walking it through. As a quick reminder, what's going to happen for the rest of the week. So on Friday, we will finish off the rest of the material. We have planned for next week, Monday and Wednesday will be review days or study days. So if you have already started studying, which I hope you have, because I know it's a busy time with exams, if you're coming across questions that you think would be great to review, please let myself or the TAs know. I'm happy to revisit material, or I can prepare a video like this if you think it'd be helpful. Just let us know what you're struggling with, and we will do everything we can to make sure that you're prepared and ready for the exam. So today, the plan will be to go through the rest of the material. I'm going to pick up right here where we left off at the end of last lecture. And from that, then all we have left to do is blood pressure on Friday. So I'll remind you, we were talking about, at the end of lecture, we were talking about this idea of the cardiac cycle and these pressure volume loops. And essentially the idea is that we can create, just like we do in respiratory physiology, one loop that shows us what's going on with both volume and pressure at the same time. So if you look back to the Wiggers diagram in the top right corner, it's the same idea, except we're taking the volume tracing and the pressure tracing and basically putting them together. So as a good study tool, or to test yourself to see if you're getting this, if you could think about what a perturbation would look like on the Wiggers diagram, for example. So let's say you change pressure, and then you can draw what that would look like compared to normal on the pressure volume loop. I think it's a great way to know if you're really getting it. So use that if it helps. We left off talking about this idea of what happens when the heart fills, and then we're going to pump it out, and you can see we'll have this isovolumetric contraction on the right side. The volume goes down as the pressure goes up, and we get blood actually exiting through the valves. Isovolumetric relaxation on the left-hand side, and then back to normal. So let's consider that our normal pressure volume loop for a given person. Okay. When we're talking about changes with venous return, particularly with an increase in venous return, you can see here quite clearly how that's going to affect stroke volume. So if where the green dot is now represents normal filling, if we were to extend that, so there's going to be a slight passive increase in pressure, but a fairly substantial increase in end-diastolic volume here, we can see that we've filled the heart more, and then when we contract the heart, the aortic valve opens, we're essentially pushing more out, and thus the stroke volume gets bigger. So it's all related to the fact we put more in it. If we push it down to the same level, in this case, just a little under 60 mils, then we're going to end up pumping more blood. So that's how our venous return is really going to affect stroke volume, as long as we pump out the same amount. Okay. Now, venous return deals with the preload side, so what goes in is going to affect what comes out, but we also need to consider what happens on the afterload side. Okay, so if there's something that's making it harder for us to pump, such as a high pressure, then that's going to change how much we get out as well. Okay, and that's going to affect stroke volume, but in a different way. So again, I'm giving you an example of sort of our normal pressure volume loop, if you will. Okay, so you can see here, I've suggested we filled to 125 mils. Okay, when the heart starts to contract, you'll see pressure is generated, but nothing happens at the beginning. Okay, because volume doesn't change until we blow the valve open, and then we hit this highest point of pressure here at the top, because we're pushing blood out the whole way. You can see volume is going down. Then as volume continues to drop off, the pressure will drop off a little until the valves close. Then the heart just relaxes without any movement of blood. We end up at our end systolic volume, and then it will passively fill, and the whole process goes again. So what happens then if we change the afterload against the ventricle has to push? So in this case, we're going to have the same filling, okay, we'll call it 125 mils again, but we may end up with a different end systolic volume. And this is why that happens. So if we change the work against which the heart has to push, right, if it has to push harder, and you can see here, we're creating a greater pressure to overcome that afterload, then we might not actually be able to eject as much blood, okay? Because we're doing all this work and we're pushing really hard, but it's not really going anywhere. Thus, the volume doesn't go down as much. Okay. So what would cause an afterload? Well, it could be hypertension would be one thing. We're pushing against a higher pressure. Thus, the heart has to generate a higher pressure in order to make that happen. It can also be affected by things like actual blockages, right? So if we're talking about a narrowing of a vessel, for example, or a stiffening of a vessel, we have to create a greater pressure to overcome that. Okay, and that can directly affect stroke volume. So in this case, you can see we filled to the same amount, but because the evacuation was lower from the ventricle, the stroke volume is smaller. Okay, that brings up this idea of ejection fraction. So in this case, in the first scenario, you can see that we started with 125 in both cases. In the first case, we pushed it all the way down to 55. In the second case, we pushed it down only to 75. So the ejection fraction, or the percentage of blood that was in the heart that is actually pushed out and ejected, is going to be lower. An ejection fraction is directly related to heart function. Another thing that can affect the way the stroke volume develops and works and how efficient the heart is being is how hard does the heart actually pump? So we can talk about contractility, right? Are we squeezing with a really good squeeze? And the NE there stands for norepinephrine. So that's something that can affect how hard the heart is going to squeeze on any given pump, okay? So again, here we are with our normal tracing, okay? And in this case, we're going to suggest that the filling was the same, okay? But the heart squeezes harder. So it's almost like decreasing afterload, right? If we squeeze harder, it's easier to push it out, okay? And if we push it out, we've generated a greater pressure here, as you can see. Thus, we push more of the stroke volume out. So started at the same amount, but squeeze more out on that contraction, and thus we have a greater ejection fraction. In the ideal situation, we could maybe even affect both ends. So here you can see I've drawn it such that the blue dot represents a greater filling. So greater venous return, end diastolic volume is higher. If the heart also squeezes more strongly, we have greater contractility, then we can actually put more in, squeeze harder, push more out. Thus, we have this huge stroke volume. Ideal function. Okay, so let's talk then about what happens when we start to change things in terms of blood, okay? So if our body senses that we have a decreased blood volume from some normal cause, that's the most likely I could think of, how's it going to react? Well, the first thing it's going to sense is that there's a decrease in peripheral venous pressure, or there would be a decrease in venous pressure, and that's eventually going to feed back and affect central pressure. Because let's say we're losing blood from a limb, for example, say you're hemorrhaging from a limb, certainly it affects the local area first, but then less blood is going back, so decreased venous pressure will occur. If we have less central venous pressure, that means less is flowing back into the atria and thus into the ventricle, and thus preload is going down. Okay? This should be a bit of a review now. If preload goes down, that means stroke volume will go down because we filled the heart less. If stroke volume goes down, cardiac output will go down. If cardiac output starts to drop off, then blood pressure is going to go down as well, right? And that makes sense because the blood pressure is driven by how much we're pushing out of it. So if the blood pressure goes down, the baroreceptors will pick that up and say, something's wrong here, our pressure is dropping. It sends that signal to the medulla, which is our central control in this case. And it will go to the effectors. So one of the first pathways we're going to see is an increase in the SNS tones. So if the sympathetic nervous system tone goes up, that's going to cause a number of things to happen. On one side, it's going to constrict the venules, which leads to an increase in pressure. And then we basically go back through that process in the opposite way. So if venous pressure goes up, preload goes up, which means the stroke volume got larger, which means cardiac output is augmented. Okay, that will result in an increase in blood pressure, which is really what we're sensing, okay? Because we don't sense cardiac output per se, we sense the blood pressure. If sympathetic nervous system tone is going up, it's also going to affect contractility at the same time. If the heart beats stronger, that will also increase stroke volume, like we just talked about in our pressure volume moves. At the same time, we're going to increase our heart rate, okay? So it has a chronotropic effect as well as an inotropic effect. And obviously, if heart rate and stroke volume go up, they both affect Q. And at the same time, we're also going to constrict the arterioles, which has a direct influence on blood pressure. So that's a really good pathway to know. If you can explain that to yourself or your friends, you can kind of walk through to redraw it in a different way. You can be pretty confident that you know what's going on. Finally, if we do get increases in arterial blood pressure, that will loop back on itself. So that increase in arterial blood pressure will be detected by the baroreceptors, which will then say, okay, we can actually back off on the sympathetic output And that's how we regulate this system. So it leads to the question, why is it that when we increase venous tone, we have this big effect on cardiac filling? I mean, it probably makes sense on some level, but why is that such an effective thing in the human body? It really comes down to this. We can consider the arteries and the veins to be both reservoirs, but reservoirs of different things. So we would consider the arteries to be a pressure reservoir, and we consider the veins to be a volume reservoir. I'll explain what I mean by that. When we talk about a pressure reservoir, this is really that idea of arterial compliance or arterial stiffness that we talked about before. Okay, so compliance is the inverse of stiffness. If something is really stiff, it doesn't want to move at all. If it's really compliant, a little change in pressure will cause a great change in the volume. Okay, so compliance can be defined as a measure of how the pressure of a vessel will change with the change in volume. So the arteries, which have a low compliance, that means if we change blood volume just a little bit, then pressure will change a whole lot. Okay, and the inverse would also be true. If we look at the veins, which have a high compliance, then a huge change in blood volume is necessary if we really want to change the pressure. Okay, it's amazing how often I can use the example of a balloon, but I think it fits here as well. And I think I used that exact same balloon in the last lecture. But you can think about, this is a relatable idea. So, you know, when you're trying to blow up balloons for the party and you get that one balloon that's really small and it's like a super thick rubber, and I don't know who makes a balloon like that, but they're really frustrating because it's really hard to get it past that point where you can actually get air into it. So that would be something with low compliance, right? So typically what you do is you take that balloon and then you stretch it out with your hands. By the way, I'm acting this out right now, even though you can't see me, but I hope you appreciate it. But you can picture you grab two parts and you stretch it and you try to make it more compliant so you can get it past that little stage where then it actually starts to fill up. Okay, so that small compliance means we need a huge pressure if we want to increase volume. Okay, if we have a high compliance, that really represents this sort of overinflated balloon that's now deflated. Okay, so if we wanted to raise pressure in that, we're really going to have to put a lot of volume in it before it stretches out and becomes it gets to that point where it's elastic again because there's lots of room. So we can put a whole lot of volume in. So why is this important? Well, we talked about arterial compliance, okay, or a lack of stiffness. But when we compare the arteries to the veins, they're designed that way on purpose. I mean, when we consider why we have the arteries, their whole role is to take those high pressures and to move flow a lot. So they have a relatively large diameter. Okay, there's not a lot of resistance there because it's a conductance vessel. The whole point is to get blood through it. They are under fairly high pressure because they're pretty close to the pump, being the heart. And they have this elastic and fibrous tissue to allow them to absorb and handle that high pressure. So that's why we call it a pressure reservoir, because really we store pressure in there. And that comes back to this idea of the waveform traveling through. So this represents on the left side of this, okay, the heart is right here on the left side, and there's the aortic valve coming in. And so as the pressure gets high enough that blood pushes open that aortic valve, then the arteries are going to expand because now this pressure is pushing out the walls, and this sort of bolus of blood will start to move all the way down here. So this front leading edge will come down, and that you can see that's how we get that pulse wave. This back edge will follow it. Okay, so it opens up to allow that to come in. It stores the pressure, and then as that sort of big lump of blood moves through, then it contracts behind it and keeps pushing it through. Okay, so that's an important point. And that's what it looks like as it goes through. So you can see that wave will come along. If I were to redraw this, I'd actually show that as these walls are contracting in, the whole thing's actually sort of moved from left to right away from that aortic valve. Okay, and it travels along until it gets downstream, and then it starts to hit the bifurcations. So if we graph it, if you're more of if a figure makes more sense to you, we can consider arterial side to look something like this. So if we add even just a little bit of volume across the bottom here, that's going to make a pretty big change in the pressure, okay? Because it's really resisting that, because the whole point is not to store volume, is to use that pressure to push things through. If we contrast that with the volume reservoir, that is the venous side, then it's going to look like this, showing that we can do the exact opposite. If we want to cause a change in pressure, we actually have to add a whole lot of volume, which means we can basically put blood into the venous side and kind of keep it there, because it's not going to have this huge effect where pressure goes up and it pushes it all back. Okay, so a small change in pressure would result in a huge change in volume. Or if we wanted to change pressure, we need to add a whole lot of volume, because the inverse is always going to be true. So let's talk specifically a little bit about heart failure. So heart failure is really, as we talked about before, anything where we mess up the function of the heart, which is to pump blood. Okay, it can be caused by a whole number of things here that you can see listed. So it could be coronary artery disease, and we'll talk about that specifically, but something that's affecting how the blood supply to the heart itself is getting through. High afterloads, and we showed that in the pressure volume loops. It could be that the ventricle is getting all stretched out, where it's sort of like your deflated balloon, or it's hypertrophying, like you can see here to the right, where the meat of the heart itself is getting too thick and the space in the ventricle is getting small. We could have issues with the diastolic side, with the systolic side. So either it's not filling or it's not ejecting the blood that goes into it, and that directly relates to dilation and hypertrophy as well. Muscle mass, it's not just necessarily that we have this eccentric failure where it gets stretched out. It could be that some of the tissue is dead. So if you have an infarct, and that's represented here, I mean, once the tissue is dead, it does not participate in squeezing that blood out. That can obviously affect how much blood is squeezed out and what happens to that stroke volume. We talked about this idea of increased resistance, okay, which could be caused by a number of things, including arterial compliance going down or stiffness going up, if that makes more sense. And certainly changes in blood volume are going to affect these things as well. We talked about this idea of how hard the heart is working, or the rate pressure product, which is going to be your peak pressure, your systolic pressure times your heart rate. So how hard is it pushing? How often is it doing it? That's going to affect the work of the heart, or the heart VO2, if you will. So I'm going to take a quick second here. I'm just going to say there's a video here. I've posted the video online. If you go into the lecture content, you will find this under the lecture videos. I'm going to do this for all the videos. I have this fear that because I'm going to put this up on YouTube so that you can actually access it, that they're going to take us down if we actually have a video included in here, because I think they have auto checking software or whatever. So the video file is there. If you want to watch it the way I would have showed it in lecture, which I encourage you to do, you can hit pause on this. It's already listed there, so you can go watch it and then come back to this. Okay, hopefully the video made sense. There's a few videos up there, by the way. You'll find them all in the same video section. So we were talking about this idea of heart failure, and we can see here using the Fick equation that cardiac output makes a huge difference, okay? Because it's a huge component of this, about the extraction of what's going on. And if we need to meet the energy demands, whether that be systemic energy demands or the energy demands of the heart, the VO2, then we're going to have to increase Q to get there, especially assuming we can't just extract more. And we know the cardiac output is made up of blood pressure and total peripheral resistance. Our body, sometimes in trying to help itself, can make more problems. And I think this is an interesting case here. So when we consider patients that have coronary artery disease, okay, so we've got blockages in the arteries that actually supply the myocardium itself. We have an issue where total peripheral resistance goes up. And in its simplest form, that I think makes a lot of sense. So if you take a tube and you make it stiffer and you block off some of the hole, then in order to get the same flow through, or at least adequate flow through, you're going to have to push that through with a greater pressure. So the way our heart is designed is that the left ventricle pumps out to the whole body, but the coronary flow comes off of that as well. Okay? So we kind of end up in this weird situation where we go, well, the heart is saying, I myself need more blood. And because we've got these blockages to get me more blood, I'm going to have to push harder to make sure I get more blood, because I'm pretty important to this whole show. What happens then, blood pressure goes up to make sure the myocardial tissue gets the blood flow it needs. Okay? But when the blood pressure goes up, that also increases the afterload, because if we have a higher afterload, now we've got to push against that. Now we need a greater pressure. Okay, as we showed in the pressure volume loops, that's going to affect our stroke volume, right? Because we have to push harder, and we can only push so much harder, and eventually that's going to affect how much we can actually push out. Okay, this kind of starts this vicious cycle. So if stroke volume is going down and we need to maintain that Q, the only other thing we can affect is heart rate. As heart rate goes up, now the heart is actually working harder and it requires more oxygen. But the whole problem in the first place was that it wasn't getting enough oxygen because flow was an issue. So we've got this challenge where we're trying to deal with the problem, and it in some ways makes the problem worse, and it exasperates things. So what ends up happening is the heart ends up beating faster, and pressure has to go up to make sure that we're getting that through. And at the same time, when the heart is beating faster, we know that we can only supply the myocardial tissue with oxygenated blood doing diastole. And if the heart is beating more often and more quickly, there's less time to do that. So you can see it kind of has a snowball effect. And that really is what I was talking about here. Okay, so stroke volume is going to be affected because the pressure goes up, and we essentially can't push out as much. So we leave more in the heart because we have a lower stroke volume. So what does the body do about that? Well, if we have an issue that we're not getting sufficient cardiac output, the body is often going to interpret that, not always, but it's going to say, okay, so we've got this issue where I'm not getting the flow that I need. So it's probably related to the fact that I don't have enough blood. Okay, because really we don't have a cardiac output sensor. What we have is baroreceptors. And what do they sense? Is they sense pressure. So it'll interpret that to say, okay, well, how do we deal with this long term? Well, we'll just adjust what's in that loop, because clearly we're low. So we'll up the volume, and we know how that volume pressure relationship works. So I'm not going to go through this specifically. I know that you studied this in other classes, but essentially we're going to turn on the RAS system, right? The whole idea there being we have the system where we can maintain fluid balances, okay? The whole process here leads to fluid absorption or reabsorption, and thus we're keeping more in. If it all works well, keep more fluid, okay, then we should actually see blood pressure go back up. Baroreceptors turn off, we think everything's good. So how's that going to affect the heart specifically? Okay, so let's start with the light blue dot on the left-hand side here. Okay. Really what I'm showing you here is different pressure volume loops and how they might look. So you can see as we go from the light blue dot, and we move a little bit here, so we have a greater filling, okay, we're going to create some passive tension in the heart. We're stretching it out a little bit more because we've got more blood coming back in, okay? So if the RAS system turns on, we have more blood volume. That means there's more blood available on the venous side, which is going to push back into the heart, increasing our venous return, thus increasing our stroke volume because we've given this greater loading, okay? As we get up to the top, that will have an effect on our active tension as well, okay? Because when we think about cross bridges and how all those things work, okay, we've pulled it a little bit into a better position, we'll get a better contraction. Think back to the Frank-Starling mechanism. I think that all kind of makes sense. Okay, so you can see here, as we increase it a little bit, we are going to get better function because we get a better contractility. Okay? But there comes a point, if we move up towards this red dot, where if we've increased our end diastolic volume too much, now function is going to be impaired. Because essentially we've pulled those cross bridges apart, we're not getting the coupling that we want, and so essentially the active tension that is developed actually isn't as effective. Okay, so now the heart starts to stretch out, and we start to get into these issues where we have eccentric heart failure. Another thing that happens when we have an increased end systolic volume, meaning we're not pushing all of that blood out, okay, and when we have these increases in left ventricular passive tension, we start to have these issues that occur either in the heart, or because of the heart's not working, they can occur really anywhere in the body. Sorry, not the heart, in the lungs, or they can occur elsewhere in the body. One of the things we need to consider about the heart is that anything that goes through the left side has to go through the right side. So if we go back to that example I talked about where we have poor coronary artery circulation, and that's really what started all this. The body's response to that was, okay, I'm not getting the blood I need to the myocardium. What am I going to do? Well, it seems like there's a resistance there. Crank up the pressure, okay? So we crank up the pressure. We've got these, we're sort of solving the problem while also creating other problems. But if the left ventricle is doing that, the same amount of blood has to go through the right ventricle. And so that means if the left side pressure went up, the right side pressure went up as well. When the right side pressure goes up, it pushes into the lungs, okay? And the lungs are fairly fragile. They're not really meant to sustain those high pressures. So one of the things we need to be aware of is that now we've got these high pressures pushing it into the lung where we can have this leakage. And so you can see there represented in the bottom, the heart is pushing hard on the left side, right side pressures go up as well, and thus we're essentially starting to fill the lungs. Okay. We've also got this issue where, as we just talked about, the body's going, hey, something's up here. I want cardiac output to be higher, so I'm going to turn on the RAS system. I'm going to keep more fluid. when we keep more fluid, we have that expansion. That was what we set out to do, but it has an issue in that it decreases the oncotic pressure. Okay, so we're basically just keeping more water. When the plasma oncotic pressure happens, then we're going to have movement of fluid. Okay, and that movement of fluid can result in edema. So you can see how it can get into the lungs. And here you can see that picture showing a before and after of somebody pushing into an edemic. I think that's a leg with a really swollen big toe. But you can see there in severe edema, even after you remove your thumb from pushing on it, you're gonna have this indent because the fluid, it's just totally swelled up in there. If you've ever, sometimes this happens with pregnant women as well. You can have real edema in the legs. So that's where the term congestive heart failure comes from. So what are the options to treat that? There are a few medications that can be used. So ACE inhibitors are going to affect angiotensin converting enzyme. So that stops the RAS system from pulling back in more fluid and reabsorbing it. Okay. Beta blockers would be another option. So if we're blocking the beta adrenergic system, that's going to slow everything down essentially. So we're slowing down heart rate, we're lowering pressure. We can go after that same idea with diuretics. So anything that actually does the opposite of keeping fluid in, a diuretic, or sometimes you might hear your grandparents call them things like water pills. Okay, if it makes you lose more fluid and urinate it out, then hopefully you have less in there. That's a good way to lower hypertension as well, and hopefully stop those effects that lead to heart failure. Calcium channel blockers are a little bit different. Calcium obviously is involved in muscle contractions, so that's actually going to lower the contractility of the heart. So these can be used in isolation or in combination to try and affect those things. And there are new classes of drugs coming out, but the whole idea here is let's stop that cycle from sort of running away with itself. Okay? So what I'm showing you here on this graph is there's our normal in the middle, so 125, and we can push all that out down to 60 or 55. But in untreated congestive heart failure, we've got this overfilling, okay, except we've got not much of an ability to push all that blood back out. So if we filled 175 and we pushed all that blood out in a massive stroke volume back down to 60, we'd be laughing. Problem is, the heart gets so stretched out because it's got so much blood in it, the passive tension is too much. We've actually lost the ability to push it out, and thus we have a low ejection fraction and a low stroke volume. Okay, I want to switch gears a little bit here. And we're going to, sorry, I don't know why I have a picture of a monkey eating ice cream, but it is quite amusing. I want to talk about why are humans unique? And there's lots of things that make us unique. But how does this relate to blood pressure? Well, one of the things we've talked about before is humans are actually unique as far as many mammals go, in that we have the ability to sweat. And so that actually is a real advantage. I mean, we talked about dogs panting and how other things cool themselves, but that's a huge advantage when we compare ourselves to other animals. And I'll show you what I mean here. This is it's kind of goofy, to be honest, but it's sort of a neat thing. The man versus horse marathon. This actually isn't a totally unique thing. There's a number of races like this around the world. If anybody follows sort of the running community, there's a very famous ultramarathon called the Western States. And legend has it that this used to be a horse race through the mountains. And on one of the early goings, they had a guy horse pulled up lame the morning of the race, so he just showed up on foot. He was determined that he was just going to run it, and then it became a running race. But they do have races now where they race humans versus horses, which sounds ridiculous because most of us wouldn't be able to beat a horse. But as it turns out, I mean, one of the things we can do is we can regulate our body temperature, and we can also run for a fairly long time. So no doubt a horse is going to destroy us in a fairly short distance, as would other mammals, like a cheetah would be way ahead of us over short distance. But humans actually evolved to hunt over long distances. And so this ability to sweat and to maintain our temperature at a good thing is advantageous. So I just want to point out a few things here. And you can see they're showing us the year and who won, a horse or a human. And there are a few cases there where humans actually won. And if you go through and look at it, in those conditions, so in 2008, you can see John McFarlane just barely lost to Duke's Touch of Fun, written by Jeffrey Allen, in a hot condition. In 2007, we can see that human won by a pretty good margin. And in 2004, you can also see that a human won by 2 minutes, let's call it. And in all of those conditions, the weather conditions were hot. So the horse's inability to cool itself as effectively as man could is really what made the difference. I also quite like that they expressed the going. How was the going? It was good. So a neat sort of example. Why does this matter? And why are we even talking about this with blood pressure? Well, I mean, one of the things we need to recognize is when we lose fluid through sweating, the whole idea to cool ourselves is cause evaporative cooling. We get it to the outside of our body, and when it evaporates, it takes a good amount of heat with it. Most of the losses, though, are going to be coming from the plasma, okay? Because that's what we push to the periphery, and it's right there, and we push it out and we sweat it out from there. So what happens then when we lose that plasma? Let's start in the top left corner here. That's showing cardiac output. And you can see here, in this case, what they did is they had people exercise for a certain period of time. So you can see that's time represented in minutes across the bottom. And then they gave them different degrees of fluid, okay? So if we start in cardiac output at the very top line here with the dark filled circles, that's what happens when they allow a lot of fluid consumption. You see cardiac output is maintained quite well in these people. If they give them a moderate amount of fluid, which is the triangles below that, we do see a drop off a little bit later, but it's not nearly as great as what happens if they gave somebody a small amount of fluid or no fluid at all, okay? So cardiac output is definitely dependent on fluid intake in a hot environment, okay? We know that cardiac output is made up of stroke volume and heart rate, so it's kind of neat to look at, well, what's happening there? And you can see if we shift to the right here, essentially the exact same pattern. So those who had the greatest losses in stroke volume were those who took in the least amount of fluid. So that is directly driving what's happening with cardiac output, okay? Not surprising, the inverse happens here with heart rate, and then we can see the group that was given the least amount of fluid had the greatest increases in heart rate, and those that took in the most had the less, because stroke volume was affected the least, so heart rate didn't have to compensate as much. I think this is sort of an interesting inclusion here at the bottom. It's one thing to talk about the heart and what's going on, but what else does the body do? Well, they looked at forearm blood flow as well, and you can see here those who brought in the most fluid didn't really change their forearm blood flow as much. You can actually see, so the full circles here, it kind of goes up over time, likely as a result of trying to get more hot blood out from the core to the periphery, right? But you can see in the groups that took in no or very little fluid, there's actually a decrease in blood flow to the arm. Why would that be? Because we're getting to the point where they're losing so much fluid, volume's going down, they're starting to sacrifice trying to lose that heat, and they're keeping it back in at the core and to use it at the working muscles. In reading through this, it seems like it must have been a glorious study to participate in, because they measured temperature in two super fun ways, one being esophageal and the other being rectal. So they went at it from both ends here, and both showed the same thing, which I'm sure participants were pleased about. They realized they didn't really need to do the rectal temperature at the same time. I don't actually know which one's worse. But the whole point being here, you can see in all groups, temperature is going to rise over time. We know that's going to happen if we're exercising in a hot environment. But the group that drank the least got significantly hotter than the others. And you can see there's sort of a dose response there, particularly when we get out over an hour. You can see that core temperature goes up more in groups that drink less. Okay. And I don't think this is surprising, but worth mentioning that the rating of perceived exertion, or how much these people thought the exercise sucked, was directly affected by how much they drank. So if you didn't drink a lot, you struggled to maintain that because your cardiac output's dropping off, your temperature is going up. Even though we're physiologists, I mean, we have to recognize that somebody's ability to perform is absolutely affected by the way they feel. So not only are you being affected sort of centrally, it's affecting the way you feel about that exercise and your desire to quit. So, some of you may know Dr. Lawrence Spreed. He's been the chair of the department. He's been around a really long time. He's a fascinating character. He used to teach this class, so I always like to take shots at him when I can. I've put up another video dealing with some of the work that's done here at Guelph. If you're not aware of it, I think it's kind of a neat thing to know that it goes on. Dr. Spreed is a leading expert in hydration. He works for Gatorade Sports Science Institute, as you can see there. So if you go back to the videos, you'll see there's a Gatorade Sports Science Institute talking about some of the work that University of Guelph researchers have done with the NHL and in hockey and stuff. So I think that's kind of a neat look at the applied research. So some take-home points. Performance in a dehydrated state is definitely compromised. And if we kind of dig through what's going on with cardiac output, which is going to affect our ability to perform, it's driven by a drop in stroke volume. Okay. So if we see stroke volume dropping off in people who are healthy, okay, and it's going to compromise their performance, then think about what happens when we take that to people who are struggling to maintain a good stroke volume to begin with. Okay. So if you have a failing heart, now what's the effect of changes in oxygen levels, changes in heat, changes in exercise, and how is that intensity going to change? So I sort of alluded to before this idea of high intensity living, right? Suddenly taking the stairs can be a massive thing if you can't compensate with that. And a lot of that is driven by what's going on with the heart. Cardiac function is obviously an important clinical tool, okay? So understanding how to treat that, how to try and prevent things from getting worse, and understanding the mechanisms that are limiting people in their day-to-day lives. Low ejection fraction does indicate heart failure, and sometimes an ICD is necessary. So I've put up another video which you can go access about ICDs and what are they and how do they work. And I think it does a pretty good job of explaining. Talked a little bit about medication to decrease afterload, okay, because we can affect blood pressure, whether that be by stopping volume from going up in the first place, or reducing the volume that is there, or changing the contractility of the heart. And with that, we will call it there for today. I hope that this video was helpful. I hope it was a little less boring than some of the other ones. I did my best. I think I'm more of a live actor. But I will see everybody Friday, so please think about your questions, think about what you want us to review, and we would be happy to do so.